My name is Eleanor. In the winter of 1984, I worked as a ledger clerk for the County Deeds Registry in Litchfield, Connecticut. My job was entirely devoid of imagination. Day after day, I cross-referenced property boundaries, municipal grid coordinates, and tax assessment numbers with absolute mathematical precision. I have never experienced anxiety, nor do I have any history of nervous conditions or overactive imagination. I am a practical person who trusts only what can be measured with a ruler and verified by ink. After my father passed away that November, I moved temporarily into my mother's home, a 2-story, white clapboard colonial built in 1922, situated precisely 4 miles outside the town center along Route 7. The nearest neighbor was a 1/4 mile down the road, completely obscured by dense stands of barren oak and pine trees. My mother was an orderly, predictable woman who kept her home immaculate and her routines rigid. On my very first night back in the house, just after the grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway struck 9:00 p.m., she pulled me aside by the linen closet. Her voice was flat, calm, and entirely devoid of emotion. She reached out, her hand gently resting on my forearm. "Eleanor," she said, looking at me with a quiet, steady gaze. "When you go upstairs tonight, leave your door unlocked. But the second bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that belonged to your uncle, must be locked from the outside before you turn off the hallway light. Every single night. We do not leave that door unlatched after dark." I nodded, assuming it was simply the eccentric, harmless habit of an aging widow clinging to an old family superstition. But psychologists say the human brain does something incredibly dangerous when it craves comfort and familiarity. It actively rationalizes the inexplicable. It completely ignores the deep, threatening shadows in a familiar room, as long as the small patch of light right in front of it is warm and welcoming enough. We choose to see safety, because the alternative requires us to admit that we are entirely unprotected. I treated her instruction like a minor household chore, turning the heavy iron key in the brass plate every evening without giving it a second thought. Looking back now, decades later in the quiet of my own life, I wish I had taken her seriously. I really do. For the first 2 months, life settled into a deeply comforting, rhythmic pattern. The house was governed entirely by sensory predictability, an environment where every sound and scent had its assigned place in the ledger of our days. Every morning precisely at 6:30 a.m., the kitchen smelled strictly of chicory-heavy black coffee, faint wood smoke from the hearth, and the sharp, clean tang of lemon-scented oil soap used to preserve the antique pine floors. I would sit at the scarred oak table, wrapped in the heavy wool of my morning cardigan, listening to the predictable, low mechanical thumping of the old General Electric refrigerator in the corner, and the rhythmic, hollow tick of the grandfather clock's pendulum downstairs. There is a profound, almost sedating peace in a house that moves exactly the way it did 30 years ago. My mother and I coexisted in a pleasant, quiet harmony that required very few words. We moved around one another like 2 well-regulated gears, rarely speaking about the recent grief of my father's passing, the family history, or the locked room at the end of the second-floor hallway. At exactly 8:15 a.m., I would turn the ignition of my sedan, drive the 4 miles into town along Route 7, and spend 8 hours in the temperature-controlled basement of the county registry, cataloging public property records and tracing land boundaries. I would return home exactly as the amber street lamps began to flicker on along the highway. Upon entering, the physical house greeted me with the exact same sequence of microacoustic feedback. The heavy timber stairs would groan in the exact same spots under my weight, the 3rd step from the bottom, and the top landing just outside the bathroom. Even the copper kettle on the stove had a predictable whistle that peaked at the exact same pitch every single evening. To an analytical mind like mine, this rigid structure wasn't boring. It was proof of stability. Everything around us felt historically grounded, entirely safe, and mathematically sound. It was a beautifully maintained world of small, polite assumptions, where the threat of the unknown was completely buried beneath the comforting repetition of our daily habits. The first structural shift in our predictable winter routine occurred in late January during a severe, blinding ice storm that brought down the old pine branches along Route 7. The sun dropped below the horizon completely by 4:30 p.m., far earlier than usual, casting the long upper hallway into an oppressive, ink-like darkness that seemed to swallow the walls. I had just gone through the nightly ritual, placing the heavy skeleton key into the brass plate of the forbidden bedroom door and hearing the heavy iron bolt click into place, when the municipal power grid failed. The sudden, total silence that descended upon the house was absolute and heavy. The comforting, mechanical thumping of the refrigerator downstairs stopped instantly, and the electric hum of the baseboard heaters died, leaving only the primitive, ticking heartbeat of the grandfather clock. As I stood paralyzed in the dark corridor, holding a single flickering brass candlestick that threw erratic shadows against the wallpaper, a low, faint acoustic noise began beneath the distant, muffled whistling of the wind outside. It didn't sound like the sharp snap of frozen timber or the familiar creak of floorboards. It sounded like a slow, rhythmic sliding friction, a deliberate weight dragging itself directly against the interior wood paneling of the locked room. My hand froze midair, inches from the cold iron of the stair railing. In that exact fraction of a second, my analytical brain experienced a critical, terrifying psychological distinction. This was not a random piece of structural settling or a passive environmental creak merely existing within my line of sight. This noise possessed a clear, calculated intent. The rhythmic friction inside the room was moving horizontally, tracking the exact position of my candlelight through the gaps in the floor. It was the explicit object of an external, highly intelligent attention, focused entirely on my solitary presence through the thick timber of the door. I forced my lungs to expand, leaning heavily on my 32 years of practical data analysis to fight off the rising panic. I rationalized the event completely, logging it away as a natural atmospheric phenomenon. I told myself it was nothing more than wind patterns creating a localized vacuum through the old attic vents. Or perhaps a sharp thermal contraction of the 1922 framing caused by the sudden drop in outdoor temperature. I walked back to my bedroom with a measured pace, blew out the candle, and forced myself to sleep in the freezing dark, pretending the numbers were still balanced. But an auditor's mind is trained by decades of professional habit to recognize when a sequence repeats with a rigid, mathematical discipline. A single discrepancy can be dismissed as a cosmic anomaly. A repeating data point, however, is an active ledger entry. The phenomenon inside the room did not vary by even a fraction of a degree. Every single night thereafter, precisely 4 minutes after the downstairs grandfather clock struck 9:00 p.m. and the iron key was turned in the brass plate, the sliding friction would begin against the opposite side of the heavy pine doorframe. It was a terrifyingly punctual display of chronological precision that no structural settling could ever replicate. To regain my sense of control, I began keeping an unofficial, highly detailed personal log in the blank grid pages at the back of my leather ledger planner. Using my fine-tipped fountain pen, I columned the data out cleanly. I noted the exact indoor and outdoor temperature, the exact barometric pressure from the kitchen weather station, the time of onset, and the precise duration of the sounds. I was attempting to map out a logical, mathematical pattern, a rational framework that would reduce this creeping dread into a simple engineering flaw. But on the second week of February, the data mutated. The sound evolved from a fluid, dragging slide into a rhythmic, measured cadence. 3 faint, distinct thuds spaced exactly 6 seconds apart. It felt less like material stress and more like a deliberate, mechanical countdown. Then came the microtension pivot, the horrifying moment the numbers looked back at the accountant. I discovered the anomaly was directly and dynamically reacting to my own physical movements. One Tuesday night, instead of walking away toward my bedroom after locking the door, I intentionally stood perfectly still on the wool hallway rug. The thudding noise inside stopped instantly, cutting off mid-stride. The silence that followed was suffocating. When I took a single, deliberate step backward, the rhythmic thudding resumed as if picking up a dropped beat. When I leaned closer, carefully bringing my ear within inches of the brass keyhole to listen, the sound ceased entirely. In that absolute, frozen stillness, I could hear the distinct, slow, rhythmic draw of cold air on the other side of the keyhole. It wasn't just a blind, lingering echo of the past. It was standing right there, adjusting its timing to mine, patiently listening to me breathe. The following Sunday morning, while my mother was resting in her armchair downstairs, I sought out Dr. Abernathy, a retired county historian and a longtime professional peer of my late father. We sat in the dim, climate-controlled sanctuary of his private study, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves of decaying city directories and municipal maps. The air in the room was entirely motionless. Between us on the low mahogany table, the steam from our teacups rose in a perfectly straight, vertical line, unbothered by drafts or sudden movements. I did not voice any hysterical theories, nor did I use words like haunting or ghost. I simply opened my leather ledger planner and laid out my neat columns of log entries, timestamps, and acoustic data points. He did not dismiss me. He did not offer a patronizing smile or gently suggest that the recent grief of losing my father was causing my senses to fracture. Instead, his expression remained flat, analytical, and heavy with a quiet, grim familiarity that chilled me far more than any outright denial could have. Without saying a word, he turned to a locked glass case behind his desk, retrieved a heavy, leather-bound surveyor's journal from 1924, and laid it over my notes. "Your house sits on the original coordinates of the old Miller homestead, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice matching the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man reading a tax assessment. He slid an ambered, brittle blueprint across the desk, his finger tracing the geometric lines of my second-floor layout. "In the bitter winter of that exact year, decades before your family purchased the property, a young girl was kept isolated in that exact northeastern upper room during a severe, highly contagious municipal quarantine. Out of a primitive instinct for survival, the family locked the heavy pine door from the outside to protect the rest of the household. When the town doctor finally arrived on a Tuesday morning, they found her perfectly still. But the county surveyor explicitly noted in the log that the interior wood at the very baseline of the door had been worn down to the raw grain by a constant, rhythmic shifting of weight in the dark. The paralyzing fear inside me shifted instantly from a shameful question of my own psychiatric sanity to a cold, verified, and documented reality. The anomaly at the end of the hall was not a trick of the wind, a thermal contraction, or a temporary hallucination brought on by a lonely winter. It was a permanent, persistent mathematical residue of an old human tragedy, a patient, silent entity waiting behind the brass latch for a lone observer to stay up just long enough to acknowledge its presence in the ledger. On my final night in that house, I decided to set a strict, unyielding physical boundary to test the absolute limits of the system. My decades in data verification had taught me that when a variable refuses to comply with logic, you must isolate it entirely. After turning the heavy iron key in the brass lock at exactly 9:00 p.m., I dragged a massive, solid oak sideboard across the hallway, wedging it directly over the locked doorframe and bracing it firmly against the opposite wall. It was a flawless structural blockade. No physical force short of a crowbar or a heavy axe could have budged that door by even a millimeter. It was a tangible, mathematical barrier meant to restore a sense of safety to the physical world. I retreated down the corridor to my bedroom, leaving my own door wide open exactly as my mother had always rigidly instructed. I lay awake under a stack of heavy wool blankets, my eyes tracking the slow, predictable shadows on the ceiling. At precisely 2:14 a.m., the ambient temperature in my room plummeted instantly, dropping with a suddenness that felt entirely unnatural. The air grew so bitter and sharp that my breath plumed into thick, white clouds, hanging suspended above my face in the dark. The anomaly bypassed our crude physical barriers entirely, proving that our material instruments mean absolutely nothing to an entity bound by a different set of rules. There was no violent sound of splintering wood, no scraping of furniture, and no forced entry. Instead, a thin, glittering layer of crystalline white frost began to spread rapidly across my bedroom floorboards, creeping inward like an icy tide from the pitch-black hallway. Then, tearing through the absolute, suffocating silence of the house, a voice cut clearly through the freezing dark. It did not echo from the far end of the hall. It came directly from the empty space at the foot of my bed, a dry, rhythmic, and matter-of-fact whisper that slowly repeated my own private county registry number from the official ledger. I did not scream, nor did I panic. My body simply remained locked in a state of primitive, protective paralysis, my heart hammering against my ribs while my senses cataloged the terrifying depth of the intrusion. The numerical safety of my world had been permanently broken. The very next morning, the exact moment the gray, cool daylight touched the frosted window panes, I packed my single suitcase, walked down the groaning stairs for the last time, and drove straight to the county registry office. I handed in my keys, resigned from my career permanently, and never spent another night under that colonial roof. 40 years have passed since that winter. I live in a modern, brightly lit apartment in the city where every door remains open and every corner is accounted for. Yet, a core part of my awareness has never truly left that 1922 colonial hallway. My decades in the deeds office taught me that boundaries are often just an illusion we print on paper to make the world feel orderly. I learned that true silence doesn't mean an absence of life or sound. Silence just means that whatever is inhabiting the room with you is no longer choosing to speak in your language. It is merely waiting for the lights to go out. If you value quiet observation, deep human behavior, and the heavy patterns that linger long after the world goes dark, consider subscribing to Rosemary Whispers. Take care of yourselves, and watch the roads when the freeze sets in.